really want to thank Code Pink and CCPJ and everybody who helped organize this event at stunningly short notice. I mean, I think everybody who got here should also be congratulated for having had their eye on the ball and looking at the emails and whatever to get here in time, which is great because this is a really, really important issue. And, you know, we had the spectacle before of people in the Senate voting for the war-enabling resolution against Iraq, and then it turned out that only 6 of them had actually read it, including Senator Clinton. So this time I think we need to be very clear what the members of the House and Senate are being asked to do and what so far too many of them have done in terms of ratcheting up the, not just the rhetoric, but the enabling legislation for a war. And that's what it was in October 2002. It was an enabling resolution. And then Bush took it and ran with it and launched the war. So I think Kara has set that up really well for us. I want to start off by listing 4 misconceptions about what is being threatened in our name against Iran. The first misconception is that it is not really an act of war. People don't say we're going to declare war on Iran. People talk about possibility of a surgical strike or an attack. They never say a war, but of course, you know, if somebody came and bombed Albemarle County office building from outside this country, it would be an act of war. You know, we would consider it to be an act of war, and under international law, it would be an act of war. So when they talk about, you know, taking out this or that target inside Iran, don't be fooled, that is an act of war. That legitimizes, under international law, all the actions that Iran can take in self-defense. And remember that we have 150,000 troops deployed, thanks to George Bush's surge, spread out very, very thinly in very vulnerable positions at the end of very vulnerable supply lines, very close to Iran's borders. So, you know, this question, it's not really an act of war, it would be an act of war. Even a naval blockade, as Kara mentioned, that this concurrent resolution is calling for a naval blockade, that would be an act of war. The only people who can declare a naval blockade, is generally considered by international lawyers, is the Security Council of the United Nations. But that is not what's being discussed in the Senate and the House right now. Okay, the second misconception is that if we take out Iran, or some, you know, subset of, that the Arab states will all really support it. And that's what they are secretly telling the administration. And they say, you know, they build on this kind of Arab versus Persian discourse, and they build on this Sunni versus Shiite discourse. Don't believe a word of it. I have spent more time in the Arab world than anybody in this current administration, with a few exceptions. Dating back to 1974, when I first went to work as a journalist in Lebanon. My husband and I were in Cairo and Jordan, and I was in Syria last year, and then I was in Syria and Lebanon again this year. We met all kinds of high-level and low-level and mid-level people from Arab countries, and they unanimously said it would be disastrous for them if the US attacked Iran. So don't believe a word of what these people tell you when they say that secretly the Arabs want us to do it. And in fact, if you look at what the Arab states closest to Iran are doing and the Arab states further from Iran are doing, they are all reaching out to Iran. President Ahmadinejad was the guest of honor at the Gulf Cooperation Council meeting back in February. George W. Bush was not. I just leave it there. Okay, the third misconception, that the Iranian people will all really support it. I probably don't need to unpack that anymore. But there is this idea, such as the Israelis had when they attacked Lebanon in 2006, that when they launch this massive attack against Lebanon, somehow the Lebanese people will rise up against Hezbollah. You know, that is not psychology. My family grew up in, well, my family is from London, and so we have these vivid memories of the Blitz. When the Blitz happened, the British knew quite who to blame. When Israel attacked Lebanon in 2006, the Lebanese people knew quite who to blame. If we attack Iran, Iran will not blame their own leaders. They will blame us. So don't be fooled by that misconception either. And then the fourth misconception I'm going to look at is the question, if we don't do it, then Israel should. And that is, in a sense, the most dangerous and damaging. And it's gotten a recent airing in this new New York Times article by my longtime friend Benny Morris, who is extremely disoriented these days, thinking that Israel could somehow attack Iran, launch an act of war against Iran, and that it wouldn't affect us. Of course it would affect us, because for Israel to get to Iran, their fighter planes would have to go through American-controlled airspace. They can't do that without our permission. The retaliation would be against Israel, and it would be against us, and with considerable justification under international law, because we would be complicit in that act of war. So we should be under no illusions whatsoever about what's really at stake if there is a war against Iran. What's at stake is, first of all, there's 150,000 US troops who are spread out in Iraq, very close to Iran's borders, and the supply lines that supply them, which go up and down, by and large up and down the Gulf, and they have a lot of supply depots and naval bases in Qatar and Kuwait and Bahrain. So all of those would be targets. And the people in the Pentagon, you know, this is a little odd, people might not know this about me. I'm a Quaker, I've been a Quaker for a number of years now, and I'm a deeply convinced Quaker, but I'm also a member of the International Institute for Strategic Studies. Turns out there is one other Quaker who's a member of the IISS. Last I heard of him, he was serving in the Green Zone in Baghdad, but we talk to each other from time to time. If our government attacks Iran, the retribution, the military retaliation would come against American positions, forces, bases, and supply lines in Iran, Iraq, and the Gulf, as I mentioned. And the whole of the Straits of Hormuz, the international oil lifeline, would be in extreme jeopardy. We think we've seen the oil shock so far. We haven't seen anything compared with what would happen if there were a war in the Gulf. I've actually come to the conclusion that all foreign wars are unwinnable in the 21st century. And I can discuss that. I've discussed it on my blog a little bit, Just World News, if you want to go to it, and I need to write more about it. But this certainly is a foreign war that is unwinnable. And the people in the Pentagon have war-gamed this out a number of times, and every time they do it, it looks as though this attack on Iran would end up being disastrous for Iran, certainly, but it would be even worse for the US military in the Gulf. That Iran would survive, but it would be catastrophic for the US military supply lines and positions and bases in Iraq and the Gulf. So we're talking about something very serious. We're talking about something so serious that it's extremely painful to me to think that our members of Congress are just blithely signing on to all this legislation without really thinking about their constituents who are there with their lives on the line. I just want to put in a little word about the role of Israel in all this, because it's very hard to mention the whole question of Iran and nuclear weapons without recognizing Israel's role. There is a very powerful pro-Israeli lobby in this country that is concentrated in an organization called AIPAC, the America-Israel Public Affairs Committee. AIPAC has been going for a long time and has had a lot of great political successes. It's had some setbacks recently. Some of its people were arrested on charges of aiding foreign powers. That would be Israel. But they are still extremely powerful, especially in Congress. on their website, they have 5 action items, 5 buttons that you go to, you know, if you want to, like, take a pro-AIPAC action. 3 of them concern ratcheting up the pressure on Iran. This pressure that our members of Congress are being subjected to is not coming from nowhere. That is one of the prime locations that it's coming from. And it really pains me to think how many people blithely give their support to AIPAC without understanding what AIPAC is doing in terms of ratcheting up these tensions toward war. It's true that Israelis and everybody in the region has reason to be concerned if Iran has a nuclear weapons program, although we were told in the NIE last November, as Kara mentioned, that they dismantled their nuclear weapons program some years ago. They are continuing with their nuclear technology program, but without any evidence that it is being diverted into a nuclear weapons program. So it's true that Israel has reason to be concerned. But guess what? Israel has its own nuclear weapons capability and is quite capable of using deterrence of all forms against Iran. Iran is quite deterrable. So, you know, what many Israelis are aiming to do is to keep their nuclear monopoly in the Middle East. There are Israelis who say it's okay. It really doesn't affect their basic security if Iran gets nuclear weapons. People like former spy chief Ephraim Halevi say, you know, so what if they get it? You know, we've got it. Like it, then it's a mutual deterrence thing, like between the US and the Soviet Union back in the day of the Cold War. So it's just some Israelis are very motivated and acting hard on this, and some Israelis are not. So let's move quickly to the question of negotiations. What needs to be negotiated between our country and Iran? How could negotiations occur? Kara was quite right to note that there are many shared interests between our country and Iran in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan. And we need to recognize that when our military actually dismantled, just demolished the Taliban regime in 2001, it did so with considerable help from the Iranians, who have been opposed to the Taliban much more consistently than our country has been, and who share a lot of strong interests in Afghanistan, which is coming to be the more important theater of fighting, as well as in Iraq. So there are shared interests, but our country and other countries have some very serious concerns about Iran. I don't want to say there are no concerns, but guess what? The Iranians have concerns about our government's actions too. So what we need to do is to have some kind of a negotiation, whether it is bilateral negotiation, face-to-face, sort of like when Nixon and Kissinger went to China back in the day and had this remarkable negotiation in which so many issues, I mean, I was pretty young then, but I gather in the 1950s there was all this thing about the yellow peril and, you know, a lot of fear-mongering in this country, and everybody thought the Chinese were about to do X, Y, or Z. And Nixon and Kissinger defused the whole thing and put the Chinese-US relationship back onto this remarkable course that we have seen ever since the 1970s. So it could be a bilateral negotiation in which a visionary US, you know, it's kind of hard to think of Nixon as a visionary, but in that regard, he truly was. And maybe, you know, for kind of very manipulative political reasons, but we needn't go into people's motivations. Let's look at their actions. That was a visionary action. So we could have the same kind of a visionary American president who would respond to the many overtures, to the next one, let's say, of the many overtures that the Iranian regime has sent out to Washington. Respond positively, and there could be what's called a grand bargain between the two sides. Or it could be a UN-sponsored negotiation that perhaps would be entered into via a negotiation over Iraq, because the situation in Iraq is one that cries out for cooperation between the two countries. So here are the concerns, how I define the concerns that our country has about Iran. There are those related to its actions in Iraq. There are those related to its nuclear technology program. There are those related to its threats against Israel and to the extremely hateful rhetoric that the president of Iran has voiced against Israel. There are concerns related to the balance of power in the Persian Gulf area and the whole of the Middle East. And now how about their concerns about us? This is where we need to be quite clear-eyed and realize that it is not, just a one-sided business. The first thing is this whole question of regime change. I mean, people in this country sort of bandy around the term as though it's just a normal option in, the arsenal of international diplomacy. That, oh sure, we could do this, or we could do that, or we could do regime change. Guess what? It is not a normal weapon in the arsenal of diplomacy. It is an extremely grave infraction of the underpinnings of diplomacy, as diplomacy has been practiced ever since the 15th or 16th century amongst nation states. Why should the Iranians sit down and discuss common concerns in Iraq or Afghanistan with us if we are trying to undermine them from inside? It just doesn't make sense. The whole point about diplomacy is that it's a way of doing business with people of whom you may disapprove heartily. We're not talking about entering an alliance with Iran. We're talking about doing business with Iran. I do business in my daily life with all kinds of people. Some of them may be racist, some of them may be bigots, some of them, but you do business with them. And when you get the opportunity and you have a conversation, you discover someone's a racist or a bigot, you maybe try to take a stand or try to understand where they're coming from or whatever, but you don't stop doing business completely just because you disapprove of somebody in your personal life. And you don't in international affairs. Even more important to be able to talk to people you disagree with, because the alternative is war, and war is always bad for people. War is always bad for men, women, and children, especially women and children, and the vulnerable elderly in society. So regime change is a concern that they have about us. And we have to recognize that this is something that our administrations have talked about for a long time. And of course there's the history of the overthrow of Mossadegh in 1953. So when they hear all this stuff about this, Iraq Democracy Support Act and whatever, it's like a reverberation, a return to 1953. Secondly, one of their concerns about our government is the direct military threats that continue to be launched. Every time a political leader of whatever color in this country says that all options are on the table, that is a code word that everybody understands for saying that we are quite prepared to launch a military attack against them, even a nuclear military attack. That is what all options are on the table means. And our country is the only one of the 5 recognized nuclear weapons states that has never taken the pledge not to be the first in any conflict to use nuclear weapons. So they have reason to be worried and anxious and concerned about everything that they see happening in Washington and coming from Washington. And then they have other concerns that we would continue the sanctions and continuing to quarantine them, continuing to try to keep them outside the world economy and the world system in the way that we have. So, like I say, there are very vivid and serious concerns on both sides, but they can be resolved through negotiation. And I think if we take nothing away from the discussion this evening, it should just, what we should take away, if we take nothing else away, is what I mean, what we should take away is just to recall how many avenues there are for opening diplomatic links and opening these important diplomatic negotiations. I talked about Nixon and China and how you could do it bilaterally. You could do it through the United Nations. You could do it through the IAEA. You could do it in any one of a number of forums. You could have the Secretary General of the United Nations or another trusted world leader act as an intermediary in the first instance. You know, human ingenuity did a tremendous amount of work planning for all kinds of military actions in recent years. So let's put, you know, just like 10% of that human ingenuity into planning for good diplomacy, and it would pay off so much more than we can imagine. So the present situation, I'll just come up to how I see the present situation in Washington, D.C. The Bush administration has made some moves in the direction of diplomacy in recent weeks. As Kara mentioned, they sent Bill Burns to Geneva to take part in the P5+1 talks with the Iranian nuclear negotiator. There have in the past been some ambassador-level discussions in Iraq about Iraq, but they never went to the next level or were continued in any way. And there has been talk recently about the reopening of an American interest section, that's sort of like a junior embassy in Tehran. So all these are really good signs, and we didn't have them a year ago. So the situation, if we're looking at Washington, is already better than it was a year ago. However, I think there is still a battle for the soul of the presidency. I think Secretary of State Gates and Secretary of Defense Gates and Secretary of State Rice are pushing in favor of diplomacy. You can see that in a number of different ways. But we still have the Vice President lurking in the background, in the shadows, which is where he prefers to operate. We don't hear a lot from him these days, and that kind of worries me. He is still hawkish. He seems to have been weakened, but he is still frequently the last man the president talks to at the end of any of these meetings. So he's still there, and meantime, Congress is playing a very bad and hawkish role, and it's that we can really start to affect. We need to, all of us, send the messages to Virgil Goode, asking him to withdraw his co-sponsorship from the House concurrent resolution. I don't know if you've done that yet. If you all want an easy way to do this stuff, go to the website of the organization that I'm affiliated with, the Friends Committee on National Legislation, and you can just put in your zip code, and they tell you exactly how to send a message to Virgil Goode, send a message to Webb, and thank him for the position that he adopted on the Senate resolution of last year. I think that was the counter-proliferation resolution. Oh no, that was the Revolutionary Guards resolution. Yeah, so Webb did well, Warner did not do well. When people do well, we need to thank them. When people do not vote the way we want them to, we need them to hear from us. So finally, I guess I should put in a quick plug for my book. My book is about the whole of US foreign policy after George W. Bush. There is quite a lot in there about the situation that our country finds itself in as a result of the most ill-considered invasion of Iraq, which has changed the international balance of forces in so many ways. You can read all about it in the book. I shan't tell it to you now. But just imagine if, by the time that we have a new president here, we find that our country has launched a war against yet another big country in the Middle East. Where would we be then? So anyway, you can buy the book afterwards, and I'll sign copies of it. Ryan, you coming up? Thanks.